Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are joining us here in the world. And welcome back if you joined our first Digital Action Lab. And for those of you that are joining us now for the first time, welcome to the second Digital Action Lab of the Global Child Forum. Today, our Digital Action Lab focuses on the question of listening to the change maker generation. And we have a very inspirational lineup of speakers coming from all over the world to discuss that topic. But before we do that, and before we start, it's my honor and pleasure to give the floor to Her Majesty Queen Sylvia to formally open the second Digital Action Lab.
Your Majesty, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you today to the Global Child Forum's second Action Lab, listening to the change maker generation. Young people's participation in civic life is a subject close to my heart. And why? Because I know and have seen how much young people can contribute to making this world a better place. At the Global Child Forum in 2018, we listened to two young workers from Indonesia, Fausa and Kisya, who shared with us their life's challenges as well as their dreams. As part of a children's advisory committee, they met with business and governmental leaders to share their experiences and ideas for better protection against harmful work and greater access to educational opportunities and health services. They have been involved in making recommendations for policies and programs to improve the lives of children, not only in Indonesia, but around the world. I will never forget their bravery, taking to the plenary stage at the palace to bring us their message. I heard in their words, I saw in their eyes, a steely determination to make the necessary changes they saw as important. They are part of the change maker generation. And there are countless more young people doing the same. Such as today's speaker, Omnia El Omrani, who is calling for youth engagement in road safety crisis and is pushing for health campaigns on smoking. His Majesty had the pleasure of hearing Omnia speak at a traffic safety conference organized by the Swedish government in February. She is part of the changemaker generation. And we will also hear from Lana Videgunant, who is leading a youth-led climate justice movement for new young activists and organizers. She is part of the changemaker generation. Collectively and individually, these young people are using their voice to make their concerns heard and to have their ideas taken seriously. We have all seen the power of the young generation. From the students in Parkland, Florida, who pushed to demand gun control legislation, to today's Fridays for Future, started by Sweden's Greta Thunberg, demanding climate action. Youth have a history of pushing social change forward. And while their slogans may be different, the youth at the forefront of these movements are no longer content to just push for change from the fringes of power. Increasingly, they are driving change themselves, either through the democratic process or by spearheading movements that command the world's attention. And this is their right. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child underscores the importance of engaging with children. Under the Convention, children have the right to express their own opinions and have those opinions heard. And while this is their right, listening to them is our privilege. Today we will discuss how business can harness the power of youth. We will ask, how can companies improve their contribution to society by listening to youth? And also, how can they benefit from it? What are the potential synergies that can be created? In November, Global Child Forum will add to this discussion by releasing a new resource called Children's Participation, a guide for the corporate sector, which will provide concrete examples and suggestions on how business can engage with young people. In the title of today's Action Lab, you will find the word change maker. With this comes the idea that change is something we make happen, not something that just happens. This young generation has shown us that they are ready to make change happen, to raise their voices, engage in meaningful dialogue, and contribute with their energy and innovation. But they can't do it alone. We need to be their partners, making change happen. You will also find the word listening in the Action Lab title, listening to the change-maker generation. But I'd like to suggest that we go beyond listening to actually doing. What this will mean for you or your business will differ. But I can guarantee that your business, your community, our world will become better. Thank you for being with us here today.
And with that, on behalf of the Global Child Forum and of all of us here today, we would like to thank Her Majesty Queen Sylvia for those words. And we heard her say that the youth of today is no longer content pushing for change from the fringes of power, but they are drivers themselves. And we would like to express our gratitude for the fact that the Royal Court and Her Majesty and His Majesty are facilitators of that process and have supported it so actively, as is also shown by the fact that both His Majesty and Her Majesty will be present with us throughout this session today, which is highly appreciated by all of us. With that, we move to our first guest of today. And our first guest comes from us all the way from Switzerland. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Vanina Faber. She is an economist and political scientist with a specialization on social innovation, entrepreneurship, and corporate responsibility, especially focusing also on the engagement with youth and children. Vanina, welcome very much to the second Digital Action Lab.
Thank you so much for the honor of this invitation and to be able to talk about the topic that is very dear to me too. And there are more than 1 billion people aged 15 to 24, what represents around 16% of the population. And every month we have 10 million people reaching working age. So I have the privilege to lead the LEA Center for Social Innovation at IMD Business Schools, where we focus on how to mobilize private capital to solve social and environmental challenges. So I will talk today precisely about my experience working with corporates, not from a human rights or social justice perspective. We have really amazing speakers after me addressing those issues today, but I will focus on youth agency recognition from a market perspective. So even more on how the corporate sector looks at the active participation of young people to support business model transformation and to bring innovation to the market. So one important topic, and I think it is in a lot of the political agenda these days that I want to mention first, but I will not go into a lot of detail, is youth entrepreneurship. And I think that is really high in the political agenda to boost competitiveness, to boost employment, and the idea of that young entrepreneurs have really the potential to bring new dynamics for growth, for jobs, for innovation. Now, even the EU 2020 growth strategy gives particular attention to this issue and promotes a very detailed action plan of how to achieve it. But if we go to a more micro level and we start thinking about the corporate sector. No, so how does the corporate sector look at youth? And I want to share with you a picture that actually is from a year ago, what sounds maybe like a lifetime ago, that I found in a newspaper, and I thought it was a very telling picture. So when I think about what do you see or what I saw in this picture, this was actually beautiful Venice that was flooded, and you have two beautiful Asian girls with luxury bags. And I think at that time, this represented a lot how corporates looked at youth as growth potential market. Millennials are a source of purchasing power, and actually this was a sector that was fastly growing. But sometimes if you look at this, it was at the expense of disregarding what was happening around us, that we were flooded, climate crisis, etc. So at the same time, in the same area, you had Greta, that was just mentioned, traveling to New York, sailing, so she would reduce carbon emissions, with a banner in the back saying, "Unite behind science." So we had these two sides of the story that were pushing corporates, one from the purchasing power side, and you had a new sector or a new youth that was driving the market, but also another part of activism thinking about doing business in a different way and addressing environmental challenges and addressing corporates to push them for change. So there is really these two views between consumers in a way and activists in other. There were other two issues that also became very relevant to what I would say to corporates. And one is, as millennials entered the labor force and had a very different profile, it was thinking about young people as employees, and how younger generations feel really greater sense of control and influence, and can push the agenda from inside the corporate places, or from inside corporations, and to push companies for change. And also, if you think, the new social media generation was thinking about how can we engage with young people, how can we collaborate with youngs as influencers, and how can corporates look at these new tools and these new perspectives if you want to understand better the markets and be more agile and react and change. So companies were already looking on ways to type, the generation said, the millennials from the purchasing power that represented more than 44 billion globally, but also on that engaging power. And I think, and what I found most interesting, and I want to address a little bit today, is that there is also a different lens. And I think what made a lot or very attractive to some corporates to engage with youth is the power that youth have to deliver a vision unconstrained by internal limitation and cost challenges when you make the analysis. That uncompromising forward-looking power of youth that pushes executives many times out of their comfort zone. And many businesses are realizing that that's actually a good thing, that you should think differently. Many corporates really struggle on how to get their people to think creatively and to challenge the status quo. So bringing youth into the decision-making process and at the same time supporting and pushing for change became kind of a way for companies to innovate. Many companies were facing two apparently unrelated problems. One was disengaged workers, especially these younger generations, and the other is a very slow and sometimes weak response to market changes. So the idea was, how can we leverage young people's insight to diversify perspectives and to actually choose and work with their own executives to be exposed to different views. So I want to bring an example that a colleague of mine, Jennifer Jordan, does a lot of research, and I collaborate in certain issues, and I look at a different angle from the innovation side, but many corporations have created youth shadow boards. And what are these youth shadow boards? Really, this is a group of non-executive young employees that work with senior executives in strategic initiatives. And I'll give you two or three quick examples. Gucci, for example, since 2015, met regularly with a shadow board with executive team, and it was behind a lot of their transformation around sustainability that actually put them ahead on the agenda in the transformation towards sustainable fashion. Accor Hotels, for example, also with a shadow board, created a hotel subscription model that provided young people under 25 for a place to stay while they were hunting for a permanent residence. So this brought innovation and a new type of product. And a company, Stora Enso, is a Finnish paper packaging company, use a shadow board to change their own internal processes. They actually call them pathfinders and path builders. And they use them to actually revise a committee assigned work, and they realized that they were over-reliant on experts and they needed to change their value change more based on market demand rather than expert view on the process. So really, all these youth boards, if you want, brought innovation of business models, of products, of processes, and even on the way they were doing business. So really that the bottom line is that youth engagement and taking seriously and listening to young voices can be the source of agility and innovation of traditional business models. And there was a mantra on the Generation Z on the Friday's action saying that the time for action is now. I know it is a bit of a cliche, but it is also true. Many cliches are sometimes. And young people are really our future, and they can help us to think precisely about the future in a different way. And let me share another picture with you, and I'll show you a bit why this topic is also very dear to me. But if we think right now, and sorry, trying to share, there's probably somewhere in a garage here, you have a young 15-year-old Bill Gates and a young Paul Allen at 17 that actually change and shape the way of the world today. And if my experience, and I'm the proud mother of two teenagers, Ella and Zoe, I think probably the adolescents or the young people that will be now changing our world for the future may have probably a different phase. If my experience in somehow can inform this, it will be probably a young girl from an emerging economy. So thank you so much for this invitation. I'm looking forward to share with the other speakers coming today.
Thank you so much, Vanina. Before we go on to other speakers, I would like to engage you a little bit in a discussion, because I mean there are so many interesting angles to what you just said, and you gave examples of companies that are good practices, perhaps best-in-class examples. Do you feel that at this point, if we take it a little bit more general, do you feel that businesses are taking youth serious as stakeholders?
I sincerely do. I think they are realizing that they need to change fast. I think there is a certain sense of urgency, and if you think the COVID crisis probably brought that sense of urgency even more apparent. So I think sometimes that vision about the future, so again, not the traditional way that they're just our consumers, but this idea that this world is changing too fast and we need younger generations, I see in the more proactive executives happening. You know, the only thing that I see a challenge is how you institutionalize that vision so that they have the proper space in the corporate sector or in the market to actually drive transformation. So you can see that at individual level. I like this idea of the shadow boards, but how can you speed or scale these kinds of innovations so youth have multiple ways to express their voice other than activism? Activism is great, but other than activism, you know, or alongside of activism.
And one of the topics you mentioned was also online presence and social media. And we know from younger generations that there's a multiple of identities that they tend to adopt to, and use also their online identity very much. Do you think that's a development that businesses have already tapped into, and how can businesses kind of respond to that?
I think businesses have realized that they also need to have different identities, know that they need to have thought leadership, that they need to express themselves. Before, I think they're learning from young people that they need to have a stronger voice, and that different media can serve to different purposes, and that they need to be mindful for that. And I think in many times, also, I think something very interesting about young generation on social media and the identity is that it's not only expressing your voice, it's engaging others. It's not only about themselves. And I think that the activism came out is also about us, to building that community. So I think businesses are trying to learn about that. It's not only about self, but it's about how you build that community and engage with others. And those that are smart enough are being able to collaborate, to build alliances, and to have a stronger voice.
That's something very important that you mentioned there, the necessity to build communities, to make things social, to be socially engaged, to the possibility to share things, to build a community around your brand or your topic. Are businesses keeping up with that? Because sometimes when I speak to businesses, they're still talking about the millennials coming into the labor market, but we've passed the millennial generation, right? We're already moving into next generation.
I agree, and I think somehow in certain cases you are right. They're still struggling with the generational gap and millennials, but I think in a certain way Greta has pushed to look at younger generations, but there's a lot of other Gretas in emerging economies focused on different issues too that were happening at the same time. So I do think that there is obviously a much broader perspective of what it means to engage with youth. But at the same time, there is also a right side, so you don't want to hire a person to be your employee at 13, you have child labor. So I think there are different ways of engaging with different ages, and there are different ways of interacting. But I do think that the interesting part is not denying that agency, not blowing it off as saying, okay, you're going to grow up and be like me, you're going to be disengaged when you turn 60. And I think many of us, and maybe it might be too much, but we're putting a lot of our expectations and hope on future generations. And especially looking at the world, I think some of us have been trying to change it, but we didn't make it on time. So we are trying to collaborate with youth or with younger people and seeing their strengths and say, okay, how can we help you to multiply this effect?
Well, you are obviously opening that door, and thank you for introducing this topic in a way to us, and also helping us to see the business perspective. I think you mentioned your daughters were Ella and Zoe. I'm sure that they will also introduce themselves as daughters, proud daughters of a mother in this case, because it's very inspirational to see the work that you are doing. So thank you for now. We will come back to you at the end of our session to wrap it up and look again at that business perspective. But for now, we're going to go on to our second guest of today. And our second guest is Julia Olsen from Our Children's Trust. Because we just heard Vanina speak about how to engage with children and how to give them that platform and not closing that door. And Our Children's Trust is unique in that sense. It's the world's only law firm dedicated exclusively to protecting the Earth's climate system for present and future generations by representing young people in global legal efforts. Julia, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Her Majesty Queen Sylvia and the whole royal family for convening this panel of the Global Child Forum. It's an honor to be here. I think if more of the world's leaders spent more time considering the effects of their decisions on the world's children, we would all live in a safer and healthier world. At Our Children's Trust, we are dedicated to uplifting the voice of young people and representing them and future generations in global legal efforts to secure their climate rights. And I'm going to show a few slides as we move forward. Let's see. There we go. So we have three really core principles in our work. One is that we lift up the voices of young people, and that's what we're talking about today. We also advocate only for science-based and legally enforceable systemic remedies in court. Third, we sue governments to protect the fundamental human rights that are unalienable to all of us. When I founded our Children's Trust 10 years ago, we knew that children needed legal representation. They were the innocent ones in the climate crisis. They didn't cause it, but they were born into it. And they will, of course, endure it and clean up after all of us. And the adult living generation is long gone. And so in this decade-long work that our Children's Trust began back in 2010, we've seen a real shift in the youth movement. So when we began, youth were marching in the streets, they were calling out to politicians to address the climate crisis, and they weren't really being heard. And many of them weren't old enough to participate in the political processes. And so by giving them access to the third branch of government and the courts, we elevated their voices in democracy and also allowed them to grab hold of more powerful media and communications platforms. So 10 years later, we're seeing youth activism really begin to get the attention that it deserves, both in the media, but also in front of the world's governments, because courts are finally starting to listen. So these are the Juliana plaintiffs, and I hope everyone can see these slides. I'm not seeing them myself. Are we good, Ruben, with the slides?
We are excellent.
Okay, great, thank you. So these are the Juliana 21, and this is perhaps one of our most well-known cases at our Children's Trust. It's the case of young people suing the United States federal government for violating their rights to life, liberty, and public trust resources. And in this case, I represent these 21 amazing young people and an NGO called Earth Guardians that is also a youth-led organization, as well as we've named Future Generations as a plaintiff in the case. And Future Generations are represented by the Guardian world-renowned climate scientist, Dr. James Hansen. And for those who may not know, listening today, although many of you probably do, the United States over the last decade has become the world's top oil and gas producer. And in our case, our US courts have acknowledged that the US federal government, through its policies and programs and practices, has really been actively backing the root cause of the climate crisis, which is, of course, the burning of fossil fuels. And our courts have said that conduct is an existential threat to the nation. The courts have also found that our plaintiffs are already suffering real harm from the climate crisis. But notwithstanding those findings, the court recently, this past January, wrongly decided that the court has no role to play. And even before hearing evidence at a trial in the case, an appellate court has said that the case can't proceed. So we have filed an appeal of that decision and are still moving forward. But meanwhile, tens of thousands of young people have been also weighing in on this case by filing what's called a friend of the court brief, or an amici curiae brief. And actually, Lana's organization, 0 Hour, has helped young people around the world to weigh in on the Juliana litigation. In addition to the Juliana case, we have cases making their way around the world, all on behalf of youth. So our Children's Trust right now has a North American front of youth-led climate litigation to protect fundamental constitutional rights in Canada, the US, and Mexico. We also have cases working their way through the courts in Uganda, India, Pakistan, as well as cases in more than 20 countries now that we've helped to either inspire or support in some way. In fact, there was a new case just filed in Australia a few weeks ago. And you can see here just how many youth-led cases have been brought. And some of them are winning. So in Colombia, youth won a landmark victory to stop the deforestation of the Amazon forest. In Norway, youth will have their constitutional case heard starting on November 4th, where all 19 justices of the Norwegian Supreme Court will sit for a week and hear argument about whether the Arctic drilling that is going on and that has been approved by the government is constitutional. In our work with youth, we know that the climate crisis is a systemic problem and that the solutions must be guided by science, not just politics. And I'll show one last photo here, which I think really helps tell this story. So here in the Western United States, I'm sure people have been aware of the fires that have been burning for several months now. And this is actually a photo about an hour south of where I live. And this is one of my plaintiffs on his family farm that's been in his family for now, I think, 5 generations. And we are dealing with smoke conditions and air quality that's been the most hazardous of anywhere on the planet in the past month. It's a time where respirators and air purifiers are a fact of life in the Western United States now. And so when we think about children's rights, and I'll just end on this note, we want to think, and when it comes to issues of science and the climate crisis, we really want to think about how governments and businesses are making decisions that are informed by the science. And what we know is that scientific protection of young people's rights can't be found in treaties like the Paris Agreement. And here's why. Those types of agreements that are political compromises that allow for heating of the earth up to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius would actually be catastrophic for young people. I mean, the unthinkable sea level rise and storms and fires that are already occurring and that will worsen with further heating is something that we all need to contend with. So at our Children's Trust, we advocate for a return to 350 parts per million, which Dr. Hansen speaks to, and not allowing more heating than we have today in terms of a legal standard. So while the youth live in a changed world already, they are rising up as the changemaker generation to confront crises like the climate crisis. And as leaders in government and business, and just as adults, I think we owe it to them to listen, and as Her Majesty said, to respond with action. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Julia. And as a lawyer myself, it's so inspirational to hear how you use legal tools to support the youth in this important cause. So many thoughts in my head about that, but we will talk to you in a little bit further on after we have heard Toko Kaime. And then we will also take some questions from our participants, from our audience for you. But at this point, first, let's go to Toko Kaime, who was a lecturer in law at the University of Leicester and senior teaching fellow at SOAS University in London, but is currently attached to a university in Bayreuth in Germany, and who has worked with the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child and can explain to us how that plays out internationally also. Toko, welcome.
Okay, thank you, Ruben, and many thanks to Her Majesty and the Royal Family for welcoming us to this Action Lab. And this afternoon, I focus on the evolution of the child's right to participation in climate change decision making. So we know that children everywhere are taking climate change as an issue of their generation. From protest to advocacy to litigation, as we've just heard, they are taking concrete and decisive action in favor of climate change action. For a number of years now, many children have taken to protesting in action on climate change because they worry that the slow and obstructive behavior by the adults who lead our public and private institutions only serves to limit the prospects of their own futures. Now, this global movement, led by children such as Ms. Thunberg and others, has galvanized children from all walks of life, all manner of socioeconomic backgrounds, to demand a future that they deserve. Governments and businesses around the world are beginning to take notice. And one key question is whether we are currently seeing a generation shift, whether we are seeing a value shift in relation to the leadership for climate change. I think this is the case. The climate movement that is spearheaded by children is definitely here to stay. It may be tempting to write off this Instagram generation as being simply ephemeral, but I think that would be a grave mistake. History tells us that we ignore protest by children and youth at our own peril. In fact, it is quite impossible to think of any substantial social movement that did not have a young, fearless people at its center. From the anti-apartheid movement of South Africa from the 70s and the 80s, all the way through to the protest movements that have been spearheaded by the Generation X and our beloved millennials, who have helped our societies make so much progress on LGBT rights, as well as contributing so much to the anti-war movement. I think we are witnessing a seismic value shift in relation to climate change debate. The interlocutors are impatient, and rightly so. They possess and are aware of their firm legal grounding, both within human rights as well as climate change law. They have the social and political capital to force change, and they will not hesitate to use it. More importantly, unlike the constituencies blocking them, they do know how to use Insta. Now, of course, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child guarantees children the right to take these steps. In this regard, the right to participate that is enshrined in Article 12 of the Convention is crucial for climate policy. Children's right to participation is crucial because these members of our societies have great capacity for doing so. At present, children's concern for the environment is not reflected in the degree to which they're able to participate meaningfully in decision-making on a wide range of global environmental issues that matter to them in the present time as well as in the future. This is the case because children and adolescents are often untapped for their roles in adaptation and mitigation measures, and they have the legal right to engage in these issues because they affect them so much. Now, children must be allowed the recognition as major parties and stakeholders to climate policy making alongside appropriate engagement mechanisms for participation. This support must be accorded to children, adolescents, and youth so that they can be encouraged and supported at both the national and local levels. There are significant climate benefits from children's rights-oriented policy, which reduces child vulnerability to climate change because it fulfills basic rights for child survival, development, protection, and participation. By delivering on climate change through a Children's Rights Convention lens, governments are not only ensuring that they deliver on their CRC obligations, but also contributing to climate action in a way that ensures sustainable development and intergenerational equity. Such an approach is also in line with Sustainable Development Goal number 4, specifically target number 7, which calls upon states to ensure that All learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including through education for human rights. Now, the question for us is whether governments and businesses are listening to this message. And if they are listening, are they taking the right actions? Or for businesses, a more important question is this: what is the cost of failure to properly consider children's participation rights in this debate? My view is that public authorities and business leaders who fail to take into consideration children's participation rights do so at their own peril, because the general message from the CRC is that we must take children seriously. In the context of climate change, this requires allowing children the space they need to demand action. It means adults sitting down and listening for a minute. It means good corporate citizens join in this movement, not just because it is right to do so, but because it makes business sense. So how do we do this in the right way? How do we operationalize Article 12? We have done tokenistic participation very well, and this largely involves railroading young people through meetings so that they can participate, but we know that they are often ill-prepared for any meaningful contribution. Often, the outcomes are the nice video and picture montages that we see in various promotional materials as examples of listening to young people. This needs to stop. What is needed now is participation 2.0. Instead of rushing children and youth through boardrooms, businesses and public institutions need to prepare the space for children's participation by, for example, preparing young people to participate meaningfully through measures such as background training, mentorship, and other processes that add value to their participation, or building in extra resources such as time to enable substantive contribution. This, in my view, is the very minimum required by Article 12. I think it is time we recognize that our children have spoken on climate change, and it is time government and business listened and listened well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toko. And then we plug in you and combine you with the West Coast of the United States to take some questions from our audience. You will find a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen in your taskbar. When you push the Q&A button, you can submit a question that will then come through to the head office here in Stockholm to put back in the discussion. Well, I'll give you a few seconds to add a few questions. I would like to start off with a question towards both of you. Toko, you mentioned that we're seeing a value shift. Is that really the case? If I was a cynic, I could say yes, but the youth has always been out there. The youth has always been one pushing for revolution. But as they will grow up, they will lose that uncompromising attitude that you spoke about, Julia. And in a few years from now, they will realize what business reality is, and they will not be as uncompromising anymore. And they just have a stronger voice now through social media. Is that what we're seeing, or do you think this is actually a value shift?
I think it is a value shift, and we can look at previous social movements and learn from what happened there. I mentioned the involvement of young people in South Africa's democratization process. We see very young school-going boys and girls engaging in protests in the 70s, and in the 80s they become mature political activists through that process that started in the 70s. So they did not lose their politics because they grew up. With this generation, what I see is that they are very adept at using social media, but they're also very articulate and are able to hold their ground. They know their legal rights, perhaps in a way that we haven't seen in other social movements. And again, this is a process of self-education that we think, and this, in my view, is unlikely to be lost from this generation. So business better take notice, because their next big clients, these socially, environmentally aware young people that needs to be listened to.
Julia, you would agree this is not a phase that will blow over?
No, I think, young people in different countries and in different generations across time have always had various struggles, sometimes for their lives and different social justice causes, but never before in the history of our planet have all children and all young people all across the world, all at the same time, known that there is an existential threat to them and their future. And young people today are talking about, should I have children? Can I have children? Can I have a family? And these are questions when so many young people see this crisis as existential. It creates a whole other level of engagement. And I agree with what Toko said about the engagement we're seeing and that we will continue to see going forward.
Thank you. We have a question coming in from our audience. I suspect this is directed at Toko. There is somebody watching who is a young African professional in the field of food science and nutrition, and that would like to know how this or how organizations support this process in Africa. What measures have been taken to implement these initiatives in African countries, and how can youth like this person, him or herself, can implement these initiatives in Africa?
Okay, so there are many layers to this question, and I'll try and address it from my perspective as a lawyer, and specifically as a human rights and environmental lawyer. We need to develop our policy, legal policy making in relation to climate change mitigation and adaptation. This is an area where we are yet to take strong ownership of the changes that we need in our jurisdictions. And when we look at our engagement with the international processes, we are not reacting to what is happening at the international stage quickly enough. And this is an area where I think we can do better. At the local level, we need to plan for the coming changes, because climate change is going to have the harshest, perhaps the harshest impacts on African polities, because we do not have the adaptive capacity and all of that. And as young people, there's space for advocacy there and awareness, but also as we get our professional careers going, to ensure that we're thinking about what our respective communities will look like in 20 years, in 30 years, and to design policies that address the kind of reality that we'll have in a world where the climate has changed.
Of course, we know that Africa as a continent has a very young population, so it definitely has huge impacts for the continent. Julia, you've traveled a long road. You've achieved a lot using the law and legal frameworks to defend the environment and in order to defend the rights of children. Are there still some roadblocks ahead that you see with regard to the right of the child to be heard?
There are. We're seeing courts around the world say that climate change is a political question. It's a question that should be resolved by the legislative and executive branches of government. And some courts are denying access to the courts by children in this way, and saying that they should just go and they should vote or they should lobby their politicians. And I think some courts have lost their way. And I think it's very critical that judges and courts around the world see the importance of allowing young people access to justice And particularly when they can't vote. Many of these young people we work with are not of age and don't have suffrage rights. And so they're really, the courts are the one branch of democracy that they can go to and should be able to go to. And I think history has shown that the political branches of government, based on majority political will not respond to the climate crisis in time without all branches of government and without business communities and everybody participating in this effort. So that's the biggest hurdle, I think, is courts seeing their role right now.
Thank you very much. And these hurdles are there, but you've overcome also many of these hurdles. In preparing for today's session, I looked into a case in my home country from the Netherlands, the Uganda Foundation versus the state of the Netherlands. And just to drive it home for our audience watching at home, what it really means, the work that both of you are involved with, I would like to read just a small part there from that case, where it actually says that the court in The Hague ordered the Dutch states to limit GHG emissions to 25% below 1990 level by 2020, finding the government's existing pledge to reduce emissions by 17% insufficient to meet the state's fair contribution towards the UN goals to keep the global temperature increase within 2 degrees Celsius. I think that's rather groundbreaking, and it's an absolutely direct result of the work that you and others are doing in this field. So we thank you very much for your contribution and your inspiration today. And for now, we unfortunately, or fortunately, also need to press on with our next guest. But thank you for taking these questions.
Thank you, Ruben.
And that gives me the pleasure of introducing our next guest, Omnia El Omrani. Omnia is a liaison officer for public health issues at the International Federation of Medical Students Associations, and she's involved in anything from research, advocacy, and capacity building for medical students, as well as co-chair to the Second World Youth Assembly for Road Safety. Omnia, welcome to today's session.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. I would love here to share in this amazing conversation that has been going on and share from my own personal experience as well as my recommendations based on that. So when I first joined my medical school in 2016, I started realizing that my duty of care does not just lie towards my patient as a future doctor, but also towards my community as a youth advocate. And that is why I decided to join my organization, which is the IFMSA. And we decided to advocate towards issues such as non-communicable diseases, anti-tobacco, as well as diabetes and so on. And I've been doing that for a while. And then I realized that actually the biggest killer in our own generation is road traffic injuries. And this is a huge global health crisis that still needs urgency and lacks it as well. So I decided to work within my organization, and we developed a series of capacity building trainings and workshops to young medical students as the future health workforce, enabling them to learn how to act in case of road traffic injuries, how to assess patients during a road crash using basic life support, but also how to advocate for safer roads, for sustainable transport, really highlighting the co-benefits of having a sustainable transport to both human health, but also the health of the environment. And at the same time, I had the opportunity to not just work within medical students and other health students, but also work with national stakeholders in Egypt, such as our government, our Ministry of Health, but also different non-governmental organizations. Together with them, we held a series of national conferences that had both youth representatives, but also business representatives and CSOs and other governmental representatives, trying to foster an intergenerational dialogue within my country. And this is really what inspired me to then afterwards join the youth task force that organized the Second World Youth Assembly that just took place this March in Stockholm in Sweden. And I was the co-chair of the assembly, and I had the opportunity to network with 167 youth delegates, and not just medical students like I always did, but students from all walks of life, talking about how to shape a safer and sustainable world for us. And at the same time, we were able during this assembly to adopt the Global Youth Statement for Road Safety that was based on 200 youth-led consultations in 74 countries. And this statement represents our commitments, our demands, and our challenges that we face towards shaping a safe mobility system. And I then had the honor to present this statement during the ministerial conference, and then also meet the stakeholders of my own country, my Minister of Transport, as well as the foundation and the NGO that I worked with back in Egypt, doing these intergenerational dialogues. So global meetings like this also gave us the opportunity to really advocate our demands and our challenges and how to address them. So my call to action today is one that I want to start with a very special quote of mine, which was done by the Lancet Countdown on Climate Change. And it says that a child born today has two pathways, either to survive or to thrive. And as youth, we choose to thrive. And based on this, I'd like to call on three different things. The first call to action is on the businesses and the different key stakeholders to really step out of your comfort zone, redesign the decision-making table in order to have us as youth, both meaningfully and also sustainably, part of the consultations, of the councils, of the different both governmental and intergovernmental panels, in order for us to showcase our efforts that we do and communicate the needs of the communities that we work with, but also our own community as youth. And then my second call to action would be to invest in, first of all, the youth-led research, because we have the proactiveness and the capability to research and identify the needs of our own generation. So invest in us and also invest in building the capacity of youth in order to shape a healthier and a more resilient post-pandemic world. And this is what COVID-19 has shown us. It has shown us the urgency and the capability of doing important and urgent action. And then my final call to action would be to promote as well as support youth-led coalitions, which is similar to the coalition that I am now part of, the Global Youth Coalition for Road Safety. And such coalitions will help youth, along with decision makers, create system solution as well as evidence-based recommendations in order to shape and build back better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omnia. And I should have mentioned for our viewers before, perhaps, that you and our next speaker both kind of represent also the younger generation in today's session, so that we don't speak just about you, but also very much with you and get inspired with you. And I think your speech here now and your call to action was absolutely inspiring. We will get back to you during a Q&A session again with our participants in a few minutes. But before we do that, I would like to introduce our second speaker here, which is Lana Weidgenant. Lana is Vice Chair of Shifting Sustainable Consumption Patterns of the UN Food Systems 2021, Deputy Director of the organization 0 Hour International that was already mentioned by Julia. And she is very active as an activist in many different panels. So Lana, please join us and add to the conversation.
Thank you. And thank you, Global Child Forum, for the opportunity to speak here today. I agree with a lot of the points that have already been made here by Omnia, by Julia, and by Soko. And I just want to add in my experiences as a youth activist. Every single day, aside from my classes and my homework, I spend hours organizing with other young activists to make this planet a better one for everyone, including for my generation, so-called Generation Z, who will be faced with the consequences of our actions on this planet the longest. Generation Z is a brave, strong generation. We have been branded with the last letter of the alphabet as if we are the last generation, but we refuse to accept this fate. You might have seen our movements which have been mentioned for climate action, for gun control, for gender equality. We have mobilized our generation again and again and raised their voices on the international level. I've been an organizer myself of various youth climate strikes with attendance of hundreds and thousands of young people and led youth to the buildings of our leaders with signs held in the air and voices asking why to the adults, the politicians, and the business leaders. Why are you destroying our futures? And if this is not children's rights, I'm not sure what is. Our right to live, to have a future, to make plans and have dreams. If you care about children's rights, you must act on climate change. For even if you eradicate any risk of child labor in your supply chain and you ensure that your employees have proper child care, as long as your business maintains investments in fossil fuels or contributes to industrial greenhouse gas emissions, you're still ultimately dooming the futures of children everywhere. That is why climate change and ecological breakdown must be centered in conversations on children's rights. But don't let me speak for all youth. Find out for yourself. Institute a youth advisory board for your business. Give youth positions of decision-making power of your corporation. Consult with youth and with children and act on our demands. If you consider yourself a children's rights advocate and this is the first time that you're hearing from young people about the issues you need to take action on, this is a problem. Youth need to be centered and heard in spaces where our issues are being discussed. We have the lived experiences of crippling climate anxiety, of lying awake at night and wondering if we'll ever have a chance at that future that we're studying for. We have the experience of seeing leaders in government and leaders of corporations talk about how they care about sustainability and about youth and children, but then just make commitments far enough out into the future that they don't have to do anything in the present as the clock keeps ticking on environmental destruction. Right now, we are not on track to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. We're not on track to meet the Paris Agreement. We're not on track to stay within a safe degree of warming, which is 1.5 or 2 degrees. And we are not on track to keep irreversible climate change processes from being set into motion within the next 10 years. Try for a moment to imagine how someone with their entire life ahead of them feels as they see none of the actions being taken that are needed to safeguard their future. Can you imagine the anxiety of someone with at least 60 years left on this planet, too young to hold any real positions of power, wondering why government and corporations are allowing their future to be destroyed? I want you to keep this anxiety on an action in mind as I let you in on some youth perspectives on business. A Generation Z-led consulting agency called Juve Consulting has found that my generation, Generation Z, is not stuck to brand names. Even a brand we have used our entire lives and that our parents and grandparents have used is not exempt from our commitments to social justice and environmental action. We are very open to switching our consumption to support new, less well-known companies, which we find to be more environmentally and socially conscious. And we often also use our digital knowledge to share with our networks the businesses we find we should or shouldn't be supporting. So is this good news or bad news? Well, it depends on how you're operating your business. If you're a business, big or small, that is purpose-driven and values-driven, looking to make the largest positive impact that you can, then this is good news for you. However, if you are looking to maintain business as usual or the status quo, to mitigate just a small amount of your negative impact in order to make consumers feel just better enough to continue supporting you, well then this is definitely something to think about with Generation Z as your future consumers. As I wrap up here today, I just want to highlight the importance of this moment. COVID-19 has made us take a step back for the first time in a long time to reflect on how we have been conducting our societies and if we truly want to continue on the same path. COVID-19 has also revealed the fragility of our food systems. And with 1 year to the UN Food Systems Summit, there is a major opportunity here to address not only climate change and infectious diseases, but health of planet, people, and children. The UN Food Systems Summit 2021 will be a year-long consultation and momentum-building process with already a great example of integrated and meaningful youth leadership. In combating climate change, it is vitally important to address not only the move to clean energy, but also the needed food systems transformation away from industrial agriculture and food waste to availability and affordability of healthy, sustainable, plant-rich diets. There are many opportunities. There are also many young people willing to guide you. My final message to you is to act urgently. As powerful digitally and via grassroots as youth are, we do not lead the businesses that shape our world. You do. So we need you to act. We desperately need someone to get us started and to step up and be a climate action leader. So why not you? Imagine if you were. You would certainly gain the support of Generation Z and future generations everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lana. I almost forgot to unmute myself because I was so engaged in your speech. Involuntarily, I got thrown back to the legendary Suzuki Severin speech in 1992 in Rio when I hear the both of you speaking, because it's so inspirational. But you both come from quite different backgrounds. We're connecting now with Egypt and I believe Baltimore, so very different parts of the world. But you have a shared passion. But in that passion, it can't have been easy to travel this road. So what are some of the obstacles that you have had along the way? And maybe even more concrete, what should the business leaders watching this forum today not do?
Yes, so I can start. I think it was really strongly pointed out before, the idea of, so on many different occasions we get invited to speak in meetings or to attend consultations, but this is why I highlighted that most of the time it may not be meaningful because we deliver a speech or we even attend without having active participation, and then there is no follow-up, which really also causes this lack of sustainability in our engagement. It is a good step to think about including youth, but then how are you going to make this inclusion consistent? And then in many occasions, we also get to be siloed. So for example, there is a big conference happening and then there's a youth event before and not happening with it. And then the outcomes coming from this youth pre-event doesn't necessarily, get incorporated in the outcomes of the actual event. So we need more integration rather than being put on the side and just expressing that, okay, we have youth there, but not necessarily our inputs integrated. We also understand that in businesses, there is a huge experience and we are still in our early stages of life. However, again, we have really that unique link between what's happening within the community, within civil society, and our activism is always going to be there. And we can easily link the needs that we identify with the decision makers, but also with the businesses, and have them make targeted interventions that can both save us and also save our planet. But I'm going to leave it to Lana now as well.
Thank you, and thank you, Omnia. And I should also mention before I give Lana the floor to our audience again, please use the Q&A bar, the Q&A button in the taskbar for this fantastic opportunity to talk to these two inspiring women.
I would love to also add in something that happens really often is that whether it's government leaders, business leaders, other adults often say, you are so inspiring. I love the work that you're doing. And then it's almost as if they take that load of not acting on climate change, of not acting for sustainability off their shoulders. And they say, okay, it's up to you now. But we need you. We need you to also support us and work with us because, like I was saying, we're not leaders of businesses. We don't hold government positions. We need the people who have these positions of powers to act. It's not just, Greta Thunberg and other youth climate activists are so inspirational and they're going to take the lead now, and what a relief we don't have to do anything. That is exactly the wrong approach. And also not focusing enough on our demands and why we're striking and why we're doing this work, and instead just saying, oh, this work is so wonderful, and moving on. Definitely not the right approach to take.
Thank you for that comment, Lana. So really integrating the different perspectives, and it's also very interesting to hear you talk. And I think, Omnia, you mentioned that also intergenerational dialogue, and that's what I get from you, Lana, as well. It's not opposing views, but it's really about finding those communalities across generations. Has that always come natural to you, or are there certain things that have been difficult in that respect?
In terms of having an intergenerational dialogue, I think now more than ever with the COVID crisis as well as the climate change crisis, this has really gave the opportunity for these kind of dialogues to happen, because now we can see how our future is being impacted, and it is our future. So this gives us this privilege to actually be part of different panels. Another example of this, for example, through my organization, I'm the only youth representative in one of the biggest global climate and health alliance, and they include me a lot and the inputs of my organization as medical students in the way that they shape their strategies, because they don't just think about current healthcare professionals, but also the future health workforce. So there are good examples. And I think if we also create a platform for such good examples of participation of youth with civil society and governments, and share best practice of such things and dialogues happening around the world, it can inspire both countries as well as businesses to replicate these examples of good practice.
Thank you, Lana. Would you like to add to that?
Yes, I'll just add in that, as Omnia was saying earlier, I completely agree. We're so close to having these dialogues because we're already being invited to events and we're having these speaking slots. If we just move to the next step, bring it past the event such that we're really integrated into further decision-making structures, into further consultation, past just talking together in an event, that's, I think, really key.
Thank you. Let's look at some questions that are also coming in, perhaps. One of the questions that is how are you using social media to build a community and momentum around issues that are important to you? And are you using social media to engage with the corporate sector?
Yes, so in terms of social media, I think this is a very important advocacy tool that we have been using, both especially when we attend meetings, but also when we want to create momentum for our initiatives. So for example, during the COVID-19 crisis, we were able to develop an interactive map that was shared through social media. And this map demonstrated 75 activities led by young advocates during COVID to address the pandemic. And then we have many different, ideas and interactions that we use social media in, and it kind of, promotes both activities that are done by youth. Even the offline activities, social media gives us the privilege of trying to showcase such initiatives and helps us reach, for example, what we're in here is the perfect example of the use of technology. I'm from Egypt and Lana from the US, and we're basically in Stockholm talking about issues that matter around the world.
Thank you, Lana. Would you like to address the question how you build community and how corporates can also work with that?
Yeah, social media has definitely been very powerful in youth movements and connecting people around the world, and in getting the word out about, for example, protests and about actions and organizing. So I would say social media has been very key in that element. And there's lots of different ways that corporations and other institutions can engage with young people, like different creative ways to use social media. I know, for example, the Youth Envoy's office with the UN will often do different Instagram filters where they ask for youth input, and you can use the filter and you can say what you think on an issue, and that's an easy way for them to interact with everyone around the world. So there's a lot of ways that institutions can be really creative here, as knowing that there are a lot of young people that will be out there in digital platforms.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I would like to come back with you to the topic that Julia also mentioned, and the topic of identity, and the fact that research shows that Gen Z is much less bound to one identity, but they take on different identities and different groups that they all feel part of, and that they can shift identities much easier than perhaps previously. Julia said perhaps companies should also be more flexible and shift a bit their branding and their identity. Is that something you see happening? Does that resonate with you? And how should companies think about youth in that perspective?
This is also very interesting for me to share my thoughts on, because I believe that when it comes to businesses, or the main goal in general is sustainable development, and we all want the same thing. So this really gives us as youth, and also gives businesses the opportunity to explore different avenues and to work together and to collaborate. And this is what we as youth do. So we all come from different perspectives, from different specialties and different viewpoints, as well as countries, but we get to work together on different issues. For example, as much as I've been advocating for road safety, I recognize the interlinkages between road safety, health, and climate change, because then when we work on sustainable transport, we're reducing the carbon emissions, addressing the climate crisis. So we should not be remaining in one area. We should be flexible, and businesses should use that as well, and be flexible to exploring different opportunities. And this is one thing I also believe in, the importance of thinking about co-benefits to every aspect. So whenever they're developing a business model, they need to think about what are the co-benefits of this initiative for health, what is the co-benefits of this initiative for the environment.
Thank you. Lana, would you like to add to that?
I would also say that this shift in identities and these different identities reflect how open youth still are, how young people don't feel stuck to any way that they have shown up before, because we are young and we can imagine ourselves and the world still being possible of so much more. And I think that's a really important way of thinking for corporations, to not just be stuck to the way that they have engaged with children's rights or other issues before, but really thinking about how they can be a leader and how they can really have the biggest impact in whatever issue it is that they care about, and not just being stuck to, oh, this is the way that other people in my sector are approaching this, this is the way that I see my competitors doing this, and really thinking about how can I really have the biggest impact, what kind of company do I really want to be?
So let me ask you then the question that comes to my mind is that the fact that there are this, let's say, multiple identities and that you can take on, is that an opportunity for business, or is that a threat to business? Because we're not quite sure how to approach it, perhaps.
I would say this should be an opportunity. I feel like that's the way you should embrace all of these new trends, is if you really learn how to use it and to make the most of it, it can be an opportunity for you. And I think that's the way it should be embraced.
Thank you. Then my final question before we unfortunately have to move on already. In the first Digital Action Lab, Jenny Lindeen mentioned a term, child washing. Kind of going through the motion, doing the process perhaps, so that you can have a tick in the box on your sustainability report for, yes, we have involved youth in this process. How does that happen, and how can you prevent kind of being used by corporates for that kind of child washing in their sustainability report?
So I think that, first of all, youth are now more aware, and they are more empowered, and they understand different concepts such as tokenism as well as child washing, and they know exactly what it means, that if they are involved, is it meaningful or not. For example, we tend to do a lot of capacity building sessions to youth, explaining what is the pyramid of meaningful engagement and what are the concepts that they need to take care of in terms of tokenism as well as child washing. So now we are more and more aware, and as we mentioned in the previous question with social media, such concepts are also further sustained due to peer education between us as youth and children as well. And I think it's important for businesses to really think about why are they engaging youth and why are they engaging children. They need to think about the benefits of it, and based on this, they develop the program. It has to start with the why, and then they can see how they can do it. This is very important, and they need to know that investing in us is literally investing in the future and in our capacities, because we are going to really lead the progress towards the sustainable development and towards this future and the world that we are part of.
Thank you very much. And if I hear you correct, it's also investing in their own business. Lana, have you a final comment here?
Yes, so to answer your first question, it definitely does happen. And I think the key question for businesses and other institutions to ask themselves is if you are really going to take action on what the young person is saying, if that is really going to be integrated into the decisions you make and the outcomes, or if it's just having that youth face or that youth voice, but then not actually going to be in the outcomes, in the decisions. So that's a question that you have to ask yourself as you're planning to engage young people, because as Anya was saying, this can be really transformative for impacting the future, for being a successful business. And that's really the key path that you should be taking is if you're going to engage young people, make sure that you are noting that down and you're going to take real action on what has been said.
Thank you very much, Lana and Omnia. I'm sure if you could, if we could organize it and you could hear it, you would get a big applause from everybody watching here today for championing your rights for your generation so well in this forum today. You are definitely being heard. With that, we move on to our next guest, and you made the bridge very nicely for me. Also, you talked about meaningful engagement, but how do you do that? At the Global Child Forum in 2018, there was a pledge made to listen to the children, and that had a follow-up with a roundtable on the children's participation. And this resulted in a project called the Children's Participation Guide for Companies, which was developed together with a group of researchers headed by Tara Collins, Associate Professor at the School of Child and Youth Care, and Kate Tistel, Professor of Childhood Policy at the University of Edinburgh. This was done with companies such as Telia, Lego, and Ikea, but also very much here at the Global Child Forum. So we would like to invite Philippa Bergen from the Global Child Forum, Head of Research and Business Development, to join us.
Hi, Ruben.
Hi, Philippa. Welcome in this inspirational 1.5 hour that we're having.
Thank you so much.
You will speak about the Children's Participation Guide for Companies. What was it that you want to find out by doing this project?
Well, actually, I was so happy to listen to Lana and Omnia saying that we would like to go beyond events. It's to have youth and children participate in decision-making for us. And as you mentioned, in 2018, we had a pledge by a number of companies who said we pledged to listen to children. And the question for us at the time was how many companies actually do listen to children in a systematic way today. And we also wanted to learn from those who have been doing this previously. What was the experience? What were wins? What were problems or challenges? And finally, as Global Child Forum, we also wanted to find out and identify what we could do to support business to participate and interact with youth in a safe and rights-based way.
Because one of the things that was mentioned by Omnia and Lana just now was very much the need also to do that in an integrated way, right? And not kind of in a silo, in a side pillar. Is that something you recognized in your research?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things that we did find out was exactly that it's important to identify the why. Why would you like to interact with children? And also take the time that everybody's spending seriously and interact whatever you can and feedback to children and youth participation what happened to their input. We also found actually that few companies do this at a regularly today, but if they do, there is a lot of learning involved for the companies themselves. The learnings that they get has really fueled both innovation, product innovation, but also company culture and general communication. And what was even more remarkable was perhaps that it's such a growing experience for young people that do participate in this kind of systematic interaction with companies. It supports these children and young people and their growth to becoming citizens, professionals, and individuals.
And we're coming from the Global Child Forum offices, and our participants watching this show are probably quite well-versed and friendly towards this subject. But when you went a little bit deeper and out into the business community, did you meet with a lot of skepticism? Because some people might say, well, really, are children and youth well equipped to understand the complicated realities of business?
Well, you know, when you ask me that, I'm thinking of a similar situation. Sometimes when you go to the doctor, you have a situation when there's two people in the room. One person is very well educated in medicine and knows how to treat different conditions. And the old way of looking at that interaction was that there's one expert and one patient. But actually, you have two experts in that room. You have one that has a medical training, and you have one that is an expert on his or her life or his or her illness or sickness. And I think it's the same thing with children and youth participation. The interaction is not there for children and youth to be expert on the business. They are there to be experts on their lives and the way they see it and their context. So I think they are definitely apt to be part of that kind of dialogue.
And what you mentioned that there were really concrete learnings involved from businesses in the field of communication and company culture.
Yeah.
Could you give us a bit of a concrete example of that?
Yeah, I could. I mean, first of all, I would like to thank the companies that have so generously participated in this project and shared both what's been going really well and what's been really a little bit more difficult. There were many companies, but I'd like I recall two specific examples. And the first one is from Ikea. Ikea has something that they call the Global Children's Panel as a regular feature of their product development that they meet children of different ages. And one of the things that they found out during these dialogues was that a lot of children expressed a need for security. And that actually resulted in Ikea developing a kind of a safe light that you use in the children's rooms. But at a wider level, many of the children that Ikea interacted with expressed stress. They experience stress in their lives. And this fact has really informed the way IKEA can be more sensitive to this in product development, in campaigns and marketing in a more safe and effective way. We actually had another example, if I may.
I'll give you 30 more seconds.
Okay, from Telia, who has interacted with children on online security many, many times for a systematic way. And one of the things they found was that they sometimes didn't even know what to ask. So systematic interaction with children can really increase your learning. And in Telia's example, they actually launched an online gaming guideline for themselves, online gaming campaign towards parents, and a resource for families that they developed with Save the Children.
Talking about resources, my final question before we move back to Vanina for a closing remark. My final question is you developed this guide, this practical guide for children's participation guide for companies. Yes. What kind of practical information can companies find in there that they could start work with?
Well, actually, it's what you said, the practical information of understanding who and how to invite children and finding the for you right children and youth to create an environment which is safe, safeguarding the youngest and the most vulnerable children, and also in order to better integrate the learnings from having this type of interaction. So it's a kind of a how-to.
And that's available for the participants to our forum today?
Well, we will send it out to all the participants of this forum as a special gift after this event.
Fantastic. Then we have also come to the practicalities of how to engage and do that in a meaningful way. So thank you very much, Filippa Bergen, for sharing.
Thank you.
So then we have come full circle because we're going back to our first guest of today, Vanina. Can I invite you back on screen with us?
Thank you so much for the invitation to join back and such a challenge to maybe summarize a little bit all that we have talked, and I think also the inspiration behind all the speakers.
What did you find most inspiring?
What I found, I would say more inspiring was the commonality between all the speakers from very different point of views, and the taking responsibility that this will take not just one-sided action, but collaboration, building platforms, enabling each other. And I think the word urgency, advocacy, coalition, intergenerational appeared a lot. And that is not enough to speak, that we really need to listen, but we also need a bias towards action and action now, and a sense of urgency, you know. And and that the voices had to be heard, and the action needs to happen in different levels. No, it has to happen in the streets, and we've seen youth movements in the streets, but it needs to happen in courts. It needs to happen inside of corporations and the market. It needs to happen at the policy level. No, so this takes this systemic type of interaction that I think Filipa was also mentioning. But also, and I think it's very interesting that came from Lana and Omnia, they reminded us of something very important that I think corporates are starting to wake up to. It's about the why. No, we need to start with the why, not only a what and the how. No, so we need the what and the hows, and we need science-based, and we need to act urgently, but also we need to understand that the why goes beyond profitability, market revenues, or a very specific solution. No, and that authenticity, and that if you want participating in the SDGs, that can be part of the why. It is a key issue. And I think, again, I want to go back to this idea of we want agency, and we want to respect and listen and enable youth, but there's still the responsibility lies on us adults to create these safe spaces and to collaborate and to be also partners in crime, and to allow, I would say, for learning opportunities and for youth development in safe and thriving spaces. No, and not also supercharge them on they're going to be the ones to bring the solution. But yes, they are equal partners, or they're partners to sit at the table and have a voice that we hear and we learn. You know.
Thank you for that summary of good summary of a lot that has been said today. And you're absolutely right. They should be seen as full co-partners, but I agree with you. The responsibility lies with us, and it's our job and our time to take action. So I hope that, first of all, thank you to all of our guests who came in from Egypt and Baltimore and Switzerland and all over the world today. Fantastic opportunity and a fantastic event here today. I hope everybody watching it enjoyed it as much as we have enjoyed producing it for you. And we look forward to meeting you hopefully again for the 3rd Digital Action Lab from the Global Child Forum. But for now, we log off here from Stockholm, and we wish you all a very good day, morning, evening, or night. Thank you very much.